Hello everyone, and welcome to a webinar hosted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Science Applications Program. This is Matt Graybaugh. I'm a science coordinator for the Southwest region of Fish and Wildlife Service, which includes Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Oklahoma. We're happy to have Louise Misztal and Sammy Hammer present to us today on indicator and spatial analysis products being developed for the Madrean Watersheds Landscape Conservation Design Project. Many of you guys know Louise and Sammy, but Louise is the Executive Director of Skyland Alliance, and Sammy is a conservation biologist and GIS specialist, also with Skyland Alliance. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Louise and Sammy.
All right, thank you, Matt. And just so you know, Matt, I can't see the chat box, so if things going horribly wrong, send me a text if you would. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. For many of you, this has been a long road, and you're pretty familiar with the Transboundary Madrean Watersheds Landscape Conservation Design. As Matt said, I'm Louise Misztal. I've been helping run this project in cooperation for a number of years now with the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and now with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Applied Science Program. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about background today around how we've worked over these past years to develop indicators and come to develop some spatial analysis. And then I'm going to pass it to Sammy Hammer, who has done more of the spatial analysis work, and will give you a preview of some of our products. So what we're trying to do today is really show you some of these initial products of this conservation design, working toward a Blueprint 1.0. We're coming up on a workshop in June where we'll be looking at these products a little more in depth. So this is just kind of an initial introduction to some of these products. So we'll go ahead and dive in. The Transboundary Madrean Watersheds is an area that was initially selected for landscape conservation design planning, like I said before, under the auspices of the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And the group has worked together quite a bit over the last few years to do collaborative visioning and planning, and the group is really focused on large landscape, interconnected system of mountains, grasslands, deserts, and waters, and focused on supporting species diversity, healthy watersheds, and ecosystem integrity. And here's a look at the geography that we initially started the conservation design planning process with. You can see it's quite a large geography in southeastern Arizona, a little bit in New Mexico, and northeastern Sonora and northwestern Chihuahua. So quite a large area with a lot of shared characteristics and a very diverse landscape. And just the landscape conservation design that we're talking about is about this large landscape planning, conservation planning, to determine what resources and ecosystems we're all collectively going to focus on, and then where and how we might do work together. And one of the things we've talked about throughout this process with all of you is the importance of the collaboration between different partners and really trying to build a structure and the learning to work together at this very large landscape, which is definitely challenging. So conservation design, we've done a lot of work over the past few years to build on existing tools, data, reports, information from all the different managers, practitioners working in the area. A lot of what we're talking about today is this piece around assessing current conditions, which sets a platform for understanding where we might go in the future. And the current conditions and what might happen in the future is really important for identifying how we respond with management actions or adaptation strategies if we're thinking about climate change. And the important piece here is that we'll be working together to design where actions can meet our collective goals, and then this important piece of monitoring and revising, which indicators are a big component of. So just a quick review of what the Transboundary Madrean Watersheds group has built together. They focused on 3 goals. Biodiversity is the first one. And this is around water, riparian systems, springs, native species and habitat, and maintaining populations of priority species. Connectivity has been a big part of our work in the Transboundary Madrean Watersheds. This was identified as an important priority from the group. And with the Sky Island ecosystems and mountains that are found here, has been a lot of emphasis on how we think about connectivity and determine how we can best maintain and increase connectivity for wildlife, including water sources, and keep habitat connected, especially in the face of a changing climate. And then socio-ecological services have also been an important part of our focus, thinking about healthy watersheds, how healthy functioning ecosystems underlie human communities and the services human communities need to thrive and benefit wildlife. So moving on to indicators. So what we've done over the last couple of years with a number of inputs that we'll go into a little more in depth in is work to develop a set of indicators that represents ecosystems across the Transboundary Madrean Watersheds and that have the power to detect changes relevant to management goals. So thinking about, again, understanding the current state of ecosystems across this region and then understanding how we're doing going forward. So indicators are designed to be measurable characteristics of ecosystems, often related to structure, composition, and functioning. They're spatially explicit. We've done a lot of work to ensure they're ecologically and socially relevant and that they're relevant to partner goals. So we've worked on developing indicators coming out of the development of these larger conservation goals. And really importantly, they're the basis for spatial analysis that can help all of you determine potentially where to conduct conservation, restoration, and climate adaptation actions. So just the landscape conservation design is a big complex process. Indicators is one little piece of it, and spatial analysis is another piece of it, both really important pieces, but this just gives you a little lay of the land of where we are in this climate smart planning cycle. So as I've showed you, we've got a vision and fundamental objectives and goals for the region. We've done a lot of work to understand high priority stressors, develop indicators, do some spatial analysis and some scenario planning. And then coming out of this is this piece about identifying possible adaptation options. So adaptation case studies are already pretty well developed with the CCAST work that hopefully many of you are familiar with, and then working toward a Madrean watershed blueprint. And then again, the indicators are a key piece of this monitoring and assessing. And for some reason, my initiation came last, and that was supposed to be first. So we started out defining the planning purpose and scope. Oh shoot. Apologies. So these boxes that are highlighted in red are really what we're focused on today, the indicators, the spatial analysis, and how those fit into a Madrean watersheds conservation blueprint. Okay, so ideally we're using indicators through this spatial analysis process to understand ecosystem status and trends and develop cross-watershed information that can support decision making. And then again, this key piece of indicators that we want indicators that can be monitored so that we can understand if our management actions are having an effect, have we reached our goals, are we doing the right things on the landscape. And ideally, we can come back to these indicators down the road and reassess them and analyze them and understand how we're doing. One important piece of the indicators, and you'll see when Sammy goes into some more detail about how they were put into spatial analysis, is that we're really trying to span a number of scales. So we've got managers and folks who are managing and stewarding resources on their own footprint on the land, and that fits into a watershed, and then those watersheds, there's ecosystems and resources that cross those watersheds. So we're trying to really provide a context on how individual pieces of the landscape and projects can contribute to this larger landscape, and how understanding how individual watersheds, for example, are contributing to these large landscape goals as well. So we've really worked to try to span these different scales. Should I go one more? Sure. Okay, so far we've worked through a process to develop a long list of potential indicators, working through existing plans and documents. We had a couple of key expert input workshops where we gathered information on what people are already monitoring, what components of ecosystems are really vital to be thinking about, and really hone those things down with some criteria. And we used ecological, practical, social, and cultural criteria to narrow indicators. And then it took some iterative work once we started really looking at these indicators in the context of doing spatial analysis to understand what sort of spatial data was available and further narrow that list based on available spatial data. And one note I'll just make is that we'll show you what we were able to actually analyze on a landscape scale. And a lot of the work we did to identify what would ideally be indicators but we might not have the data for is going into a science needs summary for the region and data needs summary. Okay, now I will pass it over to Sammy Hammer to talk to you more in depth about the spatial analysis.
Hi there, everybody. So I'm just going to start on this. This slide is just kind of an example of what happened when we took our whole list of indicators and narrowed it down to some that were a little more practical, but then tried to go and do the spatial analysis part. So one of our key ecosystems was grasslands, and one of the high priority stressors in the grasslands was the spread of invasive and non-native species. So we wanted to be able to monitor and map where invasive grasses are versus native grasses. But it turned out we couldn't find any existing data set that mapped that consistently across the whole landscape. And so far we don't seem to be able to distinguish with remote sensing data either invasive grasses versus native grasses. So that's one of our science needs for the future. So if you are missing indicators that you really love, that is probably why. So this is a list, this is a table of most of the ones that we actually pulled into spatial analysis. There are several different scales. We have some indicators that were done at a Huck 8 large watershed scale, some that were done at smaller Huck 12 scale, and then some that were done for forest cores and grassland cores and connectivity areas. And I'm not going to talk about the connectivity areas today, but I'll show you the others. So, and we also, because we wanted to try to do a lot of, we used the small Huck 12 watersheds that are, tens of square kilometers maybe, to map some of these indicators. We chose a subset of watersheds, not our whole Madrean Watersheds region, because the Huck 12s are not mapped in Mexico. So just to show you, so the larger brown boundary is the whole Madrean Watersheds region, and this blue area up top is where we actually did this first spatial analysis. So we chose all the watersheds that at least crossed into Mexico to try to represent that area too. So just to show you a few maps starting at that broadest scale, and this is zoomed into the Brawley Wash, Altar Valley, Huck 8 area. So this is I'm trying to understand grasslands in this Huck 8. So first we asked what % of the watershed did Brown and Lowe's original ecosystem mapping describe as grasslands, and that was about 47%, and we calculated how many acres that actually was. And then within the whole Huck 8, we calculated that the herbaceous to woody ratio, or woody to herbaceous ratio, depending on how you do it, within just that Brown and Low ecosystem of that Huck 8. So that's this number here, the 15.2 to 1. And then we also, another way of looking at that woody invasion part is just, we use some MODIS BCF data, or remote sensing data, that splits all the landscape up into bare ground, herbaceous vegetation, or, well, they call it no tree or tree, which is actually very tall tree, so this number might be an underestimate. That's the closest we could get to understand the woody to herbaceous ratio from remote sensing. So data that was already available. So this is looking at just the percent of this area, the brown and low grasslands have trees from this MODIS data. And then another spatial product we brought in to match up with our indicators was this North American NALCMS, the North American Land Cover Change Monitoring System, I think. And there's only 1 year of data, but it's similar to NLCD, but for all of North America. So we asked, like, within this brown and low grasslands area, what percent of that is actually mapped as grasslands with this NALCMS data? And it was actually only 12% here, because a lot of this is showing up as shrublands, actually, which gives you an idea about the woody invasion also. And we also measured some fragmentation indices for our indicators. So we have the maximum size of grassland patches from this same land cover data set, and the average size of the grassland patches in this area, so you get some idea of how fragmented the grasslands are. And then, just continuing on, we also want to know, one of the indicators was how many of the grasslands have been modified. So, like in this example, it's only about 1%. So we used the modified class and the cropland classes for this. And there are also similar questions for Sonoran Desert Scrubs. So this is the area that Brown and Low mapped as Sonoran Desert Scrub, and when we crosswalked that with the this NALCMS data set, we included anything that was tropical or subtropical shrubland that was representing Sonoran Desert Scrub. So 88% of what they mapped is still Sonoran Desert Scrub, essentially. And we did the same modification calculation for Sonoran Desert Scrub as we did for grassland. And then, so that's just kind of give you an overview of the HUC-8 and how some of these things are calculated. So now I'm going to go to this interactive viewer that we've put together so that everybody can look at this data online and explore it. Here's the link. It may not all be publicly accessible yet, but I'll finish setting all those permissions later today. So here's that map. Here's a viewer. It shows just that subset of watersheds, not the whole area. And if you go over here, there's a layer list. You can just click on that. And then I have the watersheds as the very top layer, so just turn context. You can turn that on or off if you'd like. And then you just start going through just some of the indicators that are available on here. So one is just the percent of the HUC-8 that is grassland. So it's just, and you can also turn on, there's a legend you can turn on. Unfortunately, you can't see them both at once right now. But so, and there's also, for most of them, I've configured like a pop-up. So if you click on that watershed that you're interested in, you can see what the actual numbers are. And there's an arrow here. So this is the information just for the watershed generally. And if you click that little arrow, I didn't get this one set up yet. But it should have a pop-up with just one bit of information that will tell you the percentage grassland, which, let's see, actually down. So percent grassland in this HUC is 35% about. So, and then we have the percent of each watershed that's Madrean evergreen woodland. We also included any of the vegetation classes that would have been above the Madrean evergreen woodland in each mountain range. So that's what that looks like. There's the percent of each HUC-8 that's Sonoran Desert Scrub. And you'll see that like it doesn't really make sense because over here these have relatively high numbers too, and that's because the way we calculated this was from that North American land cover system, and it's measuring tropical and subtropical shrubland. So this is basically like over here it would be what percent is Sonoran desert scrub, and over here it's more Chihuahuan desert scrub. So that's something we can address if people would like. And then here we have the percent bare ground in any of the desert scrub areas. And then here we have what percent of the Sonoran desert scrub areas are modified. So it's based on brown and low information too, and that North American land cover system. And then, and we've done the same, so that's Madrean evergreen woodlands, Sonoran desert scrub, and then there's some of the same statistics for grassland, what percent of the grasslands have been modified here. We calculated a woody to herbaceous ratio, also just within the brown and low grasslands ecosystems, and this is again that like tree to no tree ratio. And then I also mapped just the percent trees, which is going to be similar, but. And then here's a couple of the fragmentation things, like here's the mean patch size for grasslands. So you can see down here in some of the Chihuahuan desert, it's quite large patches of grassland still. And then we also have the maximum patch size displayed also. Same information for Madrean evergreen woodland. And we include like the patches again from Madrean evergreen woodland and all the ecosystems that would have been above them considered as one patch together. And then let's see. So then we move on to our grassland cores unit of analysis. So this is the Nature Conservancy's grassland plus some other data we put together to map some kind of grassland patches. Some of them are separated if there's a major highway going through it. It's separated on either side of the major highway. So this is the percent of each of those grasslands that was actually mapped as grassland with that North American, it's really hard acronym to say, system. And then the percent protected based on some of those gap protection status. So this is wilderness and similar sort of areas in the U.S. and then national parks in Mexico. And then we have the percent of the grassland cores that is modified. So you can see some of these areas are pretty heavily modified down here, maybe croplands. You kind of see that same thing around Wilcox Playa here. And then this might be a more relevant place to measure fragmentation at, but we also did the fragmentation within each grassland core. So here's like the mean patch size, and we also have the maximum patch size and the number of patches of grassland. So, and then we have the percent no tree, so non-woody cover within each of the grasslands. So higher would be better. And then we have the total vegetation percent cover based on tree plus no tree. So anything that's not bare ground. And then there's a woody to grass ratio that's similar to those others. And then we move on to the forest cores scale. And for those, so the forest cores are really aimed at the Madrean evergreen woodland ecosystem. And those actually do cover the whole Madrean Watersheds pilot area and go a little bit outside of it actually. So this is our Sky Islands layer that we already had, and then we added polygons of mountain cores outside that weren't mapped outside of our existing layer to cover the Madrean Watersheds area. So you can see this is the percent of Madrean evergreen woodland in each of these sky islands, basically. And then we have percent protected, like we have with the other scales. And we have the patch, the fragmentation indices. So here's the mean patch size for Madrean evergreen woodland within those forest cores, the maximum patch size. You can see it gets really high down here when you're starting to get to the Sierra Madre. And then the number of patches also. So, and then we have past high severity fire. So, and this is, we found out there is some data from Mexico here that we need to add in, although it still might not cover all of our mountain cores or our forest cores. But this is looking at areas with moderate and high burn severity, I believe. So it's like the percent of each forest core that's burned at that severity, and it's calculated where, so we have like anything in the last 10 years gets a full weight, and the decade before that gets half the weight contributing, and then a few years before that only gets a quarter of the weight. So you kind of fade the effect out over time. And then we have the smallest scale, our Huck 12, so I'll zoom back in. And so if you're starting again with that high severity fire, so here you can see it mapped out over all the Huck 12. And you can see the Chiricahuas really stand out here because of that burn they had recently, and some areas in the Huachucas too. So, and then we have an indicator that the risk for high severity fire, and I think this one is only going to be available in the U.S. Oh, it's not even loading. Oh, there it goes. Because it's based on land fire data. So we took their fuel loading classes and just looked at and categorized the classes as either, some of them were clearly describing areas that would burn with pretty high severity. So we took those classes and calculated the percent of each watershed that was one of these fuel classes that would burn with pretty high severity. And I mean, it's interesting too, because this is data from before the fires in the Pinaleños, and you can see that the Pinaleños really pop out as like high fire severity risk. And then they did burn. And also some areas in the Huachucas and the whetstones here. So if anybody knows of other ways to measure that, open to that also. And then we have one indicator we added actually when we were going through this narrowing the spatial data was this topographic rustiveness index, which kind of gets at the potential like resiliency to climate change. So higher numbers are better in that area, is more likely to be a bit resilient to climate change. So that's really interesting. And so more purple colors here are higher. And then, yes. Oh yeah, and so just, so let's see. And then, then we have percent protected areas like we've had with all the other scales. And you can really see like National Park in Mexico showing up over here. And then we have this human influence index, which is available for all of North America. So higher numbers, you can see Tucson really showing up. And then we also have the percent of each Huck 12s that the croplands based on that NAL CMF data. And then we calculated a few different metrics for perennial water. So we looked at, this was again some like Nature Conservancy data combined with some data from the WRC, and then we edited it so it would be good for like, calculating these metrics. So we calculated this in three different ways. We looked at the total meters of stream within each Huck 12, which is what this map shows. And then we also looked at the longest single reach, like any connected water within that Huck 12, like what was the longest amount of water. That's mapped here. It looks a little bit different. And then we also measured, so some of these, you know, we have lots of perennial streams going through multiple HUC-12s, and we wanted to see like how many meters a stream is this HUC-12 connected to outside of itself. So that's what this last figure is showing right here once it loads. So you can kind of see these areas where you have more perennial water in general, like some of the part of the San Pedro, part of the Santa Cruz over here. Down here, I should know what the stream is down here, but I don't right now. And then you see, like up here, once you get towards the rim, you can see a lot of this is connected to like parts of the Gila and other areas. So you get really high values there. Then we have the percent tree. So this is trying to get at canopy cover. It's that same MODIS VCF data. So this is the percent of each HUC-12 that is tall trees. And then just a few more. We have summer NDVI values for each area. So this is the mean for the whole HUC-12 for the whole summer over the in 2017, in the most recent year. So you can see the mountains show up as greener in general, of course. And then we also did the trend, so you can see which areas are getting greener in summers or which areas are getting less green. So these browner areas are getting less green in the summer, or well, less NDVI. And then the greener areas are getting more every summer on average in this 2000 to 2017 time frame. And then similarly, we have from MODIS the vegetation percent cover just in the most recent year. And we also have the trend in that vegetation percent cover. So let's see if this is the legend. So these more olivey areas are getting more vegetation cover. This is, I think, cumulative through the year, and these bluer areas are getting less, are trending downwards. There we go. Finally loaded the rest of it. So just we want to, so U of A did, like we have a spatial analysis team at U of A with Wim van Loon's lab, and so they derived most of these products for us, and also worked a lot on us figuring out, taking those indicators that we had to begin with and figure out how we could map them spatially, because they knew of a lot of data that was available and everything. So they've done a lot of this work, and we put it up on the viewer, and they're developing a similar one for the Eastern Mojave area also, which we modeled this after. So I think that's probably an overwhelming amount of information, but now you can take it and play with it and look at it on your own time too. So, yeah. Go back to the PowerPoint.
So I'll just make a few wrap-up comments here, and then we can go to questions. Just a quick look at where we've been, because we've kind of been talking about all kinds of things in the last 25 minutes or so. So just a reminder that we've done a lot of work to get to this point with lots of different people involved in the region. And a couple things I want to highlight on this slide. So you're seeing the direct results of some of this indicator development workshop, and then a lot, as Sammy said, of spatial analysis, GIS data discovery, and figuring out how best to analyze the questions we were trying to answer through the University of Arizona, the lab Wim is leading. And then we're coming up on, and I wanted to highlight here that in 2018, mid-year last year, we did a session on landscape conservation design at the Madrean Conference. And that was kind of the start of sharing out some of these products, but also of starting a conversation about where we go from here in terms of the collaborative and how we work together in this region, because this has been done for years under the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and now that's no longer a convening body. So that is part of what we'll be talking about at the upcoming workshop in June. That's will be hosted here in Tucson, and looking at, more in depth at these components that we've put together. So just a reminder of these pieces that we're working towards with everything we've showed you today. So next steps, immediately will be through questions today, through in-person sharing of these products, gathering feedback from all of you on how these can be most effectively presented and utilized. I realize it's a lot of information, like Sammy said. But we need, we want feedback, and it needs to continue to be iterative on how we share this information and make it available to ensure it can inform conservation actions. Another key piece is what I've already mentioned about determining how we best work together as a collaborative group in the Transboundary Madrean Watersheds, a very large region, and that will be part of upcoming discussions at workshops. And ultimately, we're working toward implementing, as a group, management and adaptation strategies that help us reach those big goals we shared at the beginning. And then ideally, we'd be revisiting the state of the Madrean watershed through use of these cross-watershed indicators at regional events in the future, like a potential Madrean conference in the future. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, we've been talking about this a lot the last couple of years. It's, we're doing this planning and analysis at a very large scale, but none of the work actually gets done at that scale. It's really important that we team up with groups like these two watershed groups listed here, and the Cienega Watershed Partnership is another example. These two are newer groups that are the ones that are actually much closer to the ground and working at a scale at which implementation of management actions is actually going to happen. So with that, I'll just remind you to save the date. So a couple of upcoming events. We have a webinar coming on Monday, June 17th at 11 a.m., the second part in this series. That one will focus on management challenges and potential adaptation and management actions. So there's a whole wealth of information that we've put together coming out of these collaborative workshops over the last 2 years and looking at what's already being done in the region and options. So we've got a lot of information to share back with you around management challenges in the region and then adaptation and management actions that we've cataloged to respond to those. And then also save the date for Tuesday, June 25th. We'll be hosting a workshop somewhere in Tucson. Again, sharing these types of data and tools to gather feedback and having this discussion about how we make decisions together as a collaborative, what can we do as a collaborative group together in the Madrean watersheds, and how are we going to do that work together going forward. So I will stop there. Here's some contact info if anybody needs to get in touch directly with myself or Sammy, and Matt, I'll let you ask us some questions.
Great, thank you, Louise and Sammy. So a lot of information to go through, and we'll acknowledge that. I mean, there are a lot of data layers that have been put together by this team of the University of Arizona and Skyline Alliance and others. So we wanted to make sure to give you all a window to kind of click through and see what we've been developing. And a big part of this is to provide you guys some context before we hopefully have you engaged in our partnership workshop coming up in about a month. So as a reminder for anybody on the line here, feel free to insert any questions you have in the group chat, and I'll relay those to Sammy and Louise because they can't see the group chat on their window right now. And I guess I'll start. I don't see any questions in here yet. If you have any problems getting a question into the chat box, send me an email and let me know. And again, I put that in the chat box. And aside from that, I'll start maybe by asking Sammy a question. You mentioned early in the talk that the data layers in the viewer might not be publicly available yet. Sammy, do you know if you'll be able to make the data layers public, and if we'll have a chance for people to review that before the workshop?
Yeah, I mean, I should be able to finish doing that today. I did it for some of them when I initially started making the map, and then I just didn't check all of them yet. So I just wanted to kind of, it might work fine, but I wanted to let people know if it doesn't, that I will fix it today.
Great, thanks, Sammy.
Email me if, you know, you try this afternoon and it's still not working, because yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll get that up and shared for everybody. You see Sammy and Louise's contact information here. Once we share out the Data Explorer, if you have any challenges with that, feel free to reach out to any of us and we can help walk you through that. The next question I have, Sammy, is, and I know we've talked about this a little bit offline, but you mentioned that a lot of the analysis was done for some of the sub-watersheds that were binational and in the U.S. Do you have a current plan for expanding that?
I'm not sure. We've been talking about, we just need to maybe choose a different unit of analysis to expand it into Mexico. Like, we've been talking about hexagons or pixels and what size to make those. So I think that we're hopefully going to discuss some of that at the workshop too. But it shouldn't be too terribly hard to expand it. At least most of the data, except for some of that fire and fuels data, is available in Mexico also.
Right, and you mentioned the one other challenge is that the watershed boundaries don't match up necessarily, right?
Yeah, well, there's a data set of smaller watersheds similar to Huck 12s in Mexico, but when you look at it, I'm not exactly sure what happened, but it's sort of nonsensical. Like, there are some things that are obviously not watersheds, some of the polygons in there. So yeah, that's where the challenge was, is there wasn't that smaller unit to match up with the US part. So, but thankfully, like, whoever did the mapping of the US watersheds mapped them into Mexico, probably USGS, I'm sure, or for the ones that were cross-boundary like that.
Right.
Does that make that question?
Yep, that's good. And we have another question that maybe I'll hand over to Louise. And so we've talked about some examples already, but a question from Phil Hammond is if there's a case study on the application of any of these data layers to a conservation decision. And the short answer for this one, perhaps, Phil, is that we haven't, not for this landscape conservation design, but there are several other conservation design examples that have moved from the indicator process to supporting conservation decisions. And Louise, maybe I'll hand it over to you to talk about some of the examples that we've looked at.
Yeah, so we've looked a lot at, I second what Matt said, that we're just rolling this out, this particular analysis, so we're hoping to have those examples in the coming year in the Madrean watersheds. For sure, there's examples of this kind of conservation blueprint work being applied in the South Atlantic landscape, which was another landscape cooperative where purchase decisions around land protection, other kinds of decisions have been made with this kind of information. What else were you thinking about, Matt, when you applied example? I think you might have something in your mind that's not in mine.
No, I guess to expand on that a little bit, again, we followed some of the models that were out there from other landscape conservation cooperatives to kind of roll this out, with the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint being one of the examples that's furthest along, where they integrated several different data layers to develop areas of primary conservation priority, I guess would be the short way to put it. So there's been some regional initiatives as well through the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, which is an effort to merge some of these landscape conservation designs from the Southeast. So there's precedent for these, and it's still a priority for the Science Applications Program within Fish and Wildlife Service. But really, yeah, just we're not there yet for this one, but that is the goal for these data layers and the next steps, which is really what we need workshop participants help hammering out, starting next month. And I think perhaps we can start talking about that as again, with management strategies webinar as well.
Yeah, and one other thing I would add is those 2 watershed group examples and the Cienega Watershed Partnership are have been developing indicators as well for their thinking about their watersheds and how they prioritize work. And so we've been working to try and integrate some of that into this thinking and bridge that so that ideally there's this connection between a large landscape picture and then indicators within a watershed. And so there's a lot of possibility there for really aligning efforts at a larger scale with this place-based work as well.
Thanks, Louise. Any other questions here before we wrap it up? Okay, another question in here, Louise. Is there a long term to use this information to identify priority areas in need of conservation? I think that's part of what we just expand. Yes, so is there a long-term plan to use this information to identify priority areas in need of conservation?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that work is what's coming up with the workshop we've been talking about and this bigger conversation about how we work together to coordinate across the large landscape given the situation. I mean, I can see a mix of this information being used by individual practitioners or land managers within their own, footprint on the landscape to make some decisions, but also some bigger decisions about priority areas, priority watersheds, areas where we're going to focus as a large landscape collaborative group to try to align efforts and have more effect across the landscape. So it's definitely that piece of it means coordination going forward and making sure that we get this information out far and wide to people to use, and that it's also useful to people based on feedback we get over the coming, few months with the upcoming workshop and other venues.
Okay, another it's more of a comment in here that I'll share from Julie Sittig. And she says, the Altar Valley Conservation Alliance is writing a watershed restoration plan. We will incorporate data from the Madrean into our analysis of current conditions and develop desired conditions and priority projects with the collective goals of Madrean partners in mind. So that's one example, again, more on the horizon, but it kind of reiterates what Louise was saying a couple minutes ago, where we need to get this information together in a way that's useful to support, smaller scale partnerships as well as even individual landowners and managers to inform, their management actions. So, great. Any other questions here? Last chance. Okay, so with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to contact any of us. Contact information is still there online. And I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar on a Tuesday after a long weekend here and dealing with some of the challenges. So appreciate your patience for that. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and it will be made available on YouTube. You can access the channel on the Desert Landscape Conservation Center website, which is desertlcc.org. You can also find it by just searching for Desert LCC YouTube. And you'll see several old previous videos, previous recordings on there, including the latest, which was a presentation on conservation challenges within the Big Bend area and the Rio Grande in the US and Mexico. So this one will be posted online as well, hopefully within a week or so. And with that, I'll thank everyone one last time and hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.